Brian Oliver presents Haunting Tales of Madness.
He Always Had an Umbrella. Written by Brian Oliver. Narrated by Daniel Oliver. Chapter 1. April 12th, 1941. This was when the man with the umbrella entered my life. It was also the last night of the conflict. That bloody conflict which had no value to the majority of those affected. For now, however, let me focus on the man. He had an umbrella. I never knew why until today. I saw him nearly everywhere I went. He always had that umbrella. I'll never forget the first time I saw him. As I jumped out of the ambulance, I had begun to work on our crumpled patient straight away. The collision had left the poor woman nearly sawn in half. It was hard to tell if her hair was naturally red or just dyed from all the blood. The rain falling upon us mixed with blood and bathed my medical gear in crimson. She was a local farmer, and in a rural area of the country, her horse and buggy were as normal as seeing an Austin 10 auto parked along Main Street. To be quite honest, most of the farmers in our area still used real horsepower over an engine. It was no wonder that things were so bad. The battle all around us had caused so much damage. Roads were hardly roads. Anything could have been a landmine. Buildings ready to collapse. We weren't even at war. The riots had broken out over a religious dispute and oil rights. Now the police and the citizens were at it day and night. The citizens proving just as relentless as any army. The police using military strategy and taking the whole area further into debt by way of asking for military-level equipment. No side was right, and those just trying to live life day to day were paying the price. You could say that April 12th was the worst day of it. 14 months beforehand, the Grand Pontiff had declared church superiority and divine command over lands known to be rich in oil and other fuel sources. With this declaration came the protections and control of the land by the church. Protections were just another word for monopoly. Seeing as they were the church, they kept the land without so much as paying property taxes. It wasn't long after that they had nearly every politician in their pocket, and unless you were a worshiper and loyal tither to their church, you were not usually lucky enough to get work. The politicians ensured this, creating new laws that meant negating the vote of the people. Then, April 12th happened. I was nestled quite peacefully in my bed that night. The fire was keeping the house toasty, the dog, Chasko, asleep at my feet. The entire house shook so violently that logs rolled out of the fireplace. I was so disoriented that it took me several minutes to make my way out. It wasn't until after the fire brigade drove right past and continued on toward the temple that I realized how low on the totem pole I was. The entire temple was burning and lighting up the night sky. I've never seen anything like it. The riots, a full-blown war. In the first year, nearly 6,000 people, good people, were killed in the name of the Pontiff. Between the zealots and the farmers, the zealots were truly outnumbered, but they had the wealth and the backing of the political and military system. As a member of the NMR, or National Medical Regiment, I was considered a non-combatant, and neither side would dare fire upon NMR members. Without us, and our solemn vow to save any life in need, both sides knew they had no chance at all. When we showed up, it was nearly a guarantee that the fighting would move elsewhere. Just because the fight moves, though, does not mean the damage is undone. Chapter 2. Samantha. Thunder crackled in the air. The remains from the collision only kept from burning up thanks to the rain. It was 8 p.m. on April 12th. After leaping from the back of my unit, medical gear in hand, I saw the collision. The woman and her horse cart were struck in the intersection by a 1938 Buick Special. The driver of the Buick must have been moving like a bat out of hell when he collided with the cart. His body was not so much against, but wrapped around the light pole across the intersection. The windshield did not seem to slow him much. His open, dead eyes aimed in the direction of his unwitting and undeserving target. My partner Carl ran swiftly around me, having found a small child who was also involved. I rushed to help the driver of the cart. "Just look at me. Don't look at anything else, okay?" I held her hand as she stared at me, the horror in her eyes. She knew it was coming. "What's your name? Don't look down," I said, trying to keep her attention. My coworkers were trying to find anyone else who may still be breathing. "Samantha," she said, gasping. "Okay, Samantha, you're doing great. Just stay with me, all right?" Samantha? Her gasping had started to slow. Samantha's face began to look nearly gray and gaunt as she seemed at peace. Then I saw him. In her eyes, I saw his reflection. When I looked back, there was no one. It was the lack of pressure from her hand. I didn't have to glance back to her to know. Samantha was gone. Her blood, the rain, and blood from the horse soaked into my work clothes and stained my medical bag. In my mind, I assumed I must have just seen a shadow reflecting back at me, but now I know differently. While I sat there holding her hand, my coworker approached, kneeling next to Samantha's body. "Anyone make it, Carl?" I asked, knowing the answer already. He shook his head no. There was water falling on us from the storm running down his blonde hair. The tear welling from his sky-blue eyes were melding with the rain. No one, Gavin. There was a child in the back. I'd give my life to never see such a thing again, I said. I would too, said Carl. Can we just have 1 year of not this? Hell, I'd give up the whole town to end this violence, I said quietly.
I agree.
What was that, Carl? I asked. He looked at me, confused. I didn't say anything. Shaking my head, perhaps I was simply hearing things, we began the long and terrible process of gathering the bodies, and if I'm to be totally honest with you, I was beginning to question what the point of kicking around any longer would be. When we arrived at the morgue, we were greeted by Dr. Shepard. He had salt and pepper hair, but still a full head of it. His beard was scruffy and his eyes tired. As we wheeled in the corpses, Shepard stopped me. Gavin, how much longer, you think? He asked. I wish I knew, Doc. I wish I knew. A few hours later, I went to check on the good doctor. Samantha laid there on the cold metal table. Doc had done his best to piece her back together, but I could tell he was disappointed in himself. Doc Shepard was sitting next to his old radio, his hands covering his mouth as the reporter announced the ceasefire. My jaw dropped as I stood there, mouth agape, listening to the news of the Grand Pontiff giving himself up. Chapter 3. The Unexpected Peace. Over the next year, we had what we lovingly called our grace period. Living in a small rural area with few people, accidents like the one that took the life of Samantha are few and far between. 6 people had died that night in her accident, and nearly 40 from aggressive accidents from the church before the shooting stopped. It had rocked the town. The mortuary was not set up for such a tragic event. Ridge Spring was not a town at all ready for the year it had just waded through. The people, however, showed their true sense of family and pulled through it. The villagers all seemed to gather themselves up and carry on. The harvest was plentiful, and the mill outside of town kept our economy strong. The next several months were shadowed by the dead, but happily, not one of the wounded caught any dreaded fatal infections. Peace started the night of Samantha's accident. For no reason that I could fathom at the time, the elders of the church and their political cohorts called it all off. They laid down their arms and announced the decision to give in to the wishes of the people. More than one member of the community took this news with obvious skepticism, but the actions of the church and government seemed to put the proof in the pudding. Water rights and mineral rights were given back to the landowners. Food rationing was coming to an end as the storehouses opened. The Grand Pontiff had stepped down and turned himself over to the people. They were merciful enough to grant him a life sentence for crimes against the population and his hypocrisy against his own faith. Many of the zealots, those that were the most intense true believers, demanded to be imprisoned with their leader. We were all too happy to oblige them, and taking in more inmates meant an increase in jobs for those looking for a way to earn enough to rebuild their destroyed properties. We held festivals, re-engineered our primary roads, and several residential areas made great strides in rebuilding from the previous battles. One of the strangest things, at least it is now that I think about it, was that it was as if the entire village in which I lived changed to a vegetarian lifestyle overnight. That included me. The local grocers had nearly a month of adapting to having extra produce to order, and the meat on the shelves simply sat there until the past good date had come and gone. I personally also had a nice batch of good luck, having met the most amazing woman I would ever come across. Long dark hair, bright green eyes, and a smile that would melt even the harshest of characters. Her name was Ashley. I came to find myself in her presence as I was hauling the trash out of work. Having nearly knocked her over near the entrance to the alleyway, and as I spun to keep from hitting her with the trash, I hit the rail to the steps leading into the station. tore the bag open, and was abruptly covered in all kinds of unpleasantness. She giggled and then gasped as she realized just what a mess was caused. After assuring her that no apology was needed, I asked her name, and she asked to buy me a cup of coffee as penance for the mess which neither of us would accept as the fault of the other. Humbly, I agreed to go. My roommate had more than a good chuckle laughing at me that night as I was frantically trying to spruce up and, without thinking about it, snipped too much of my mustache in one accidental swoop of the trimming scissors. I guess that meant she was going to see me as my friends and family did before I decided I preferred facial hair. It took her a minute to recognize me when I found her at the cafe and sat myself down. I could swear at first she was going to throw coffee on me, assuming I was a stranger just taking my seat at her table. We sat and spoke about our interests and laughed at my clumsiness. I looked out the window of the cafe in which we sat. Across the street, I saw him. He was just standing at the crosswalk of the street. In his hand, he held an umbrella. At first, I thought perhaps it was a cane, but no, it was an umbrella, folded up as the weather was pleasantly sunny. He seemed to have taken notice of me through the window. I could swear he locked eyes with me. Tipped his hat, he smiled a smile that was pleasant and yet filled me with a feeling of unease. I blinked, and as the car went by, the man was gone. Looking back, I realized this was the same intersection of Samantha's accident. "So what do you think of my idea?" Ashley prodded me as I came back to the situation. "I'm sorry, I spaced for a minute. Which idea are you referring to?" I replied. The look she gave me could have frozen fire in its place. "That better be a joke," she said. "I don't invite everyone back to my place." It dawned on me how bad I am at dating and choked on my coffee. "Oh," I exclaimed. "Oh, yes, that sounds like a perfect idea. The best idea I have heard in a long time." Allow me to skip the details, but I can tell you that Ashley was mercifully forgiving of my moment of being a dumb man, and she quickly became the number one priority in my life. As a gentleman, it would be rude to kiss and tell, but I admit we had a passionate evening, followed by several more. I know it seems fast. I admit that she had me completely smitten. Within the first half of our second month of dating, Ashley and I moved in together. Those in our community who still held their church ties were less than pleased and quite vocal about their feelings, but with a woman like Ashley, I could not possibly have cared less about their points of view. One morning, we saw that our neighbors' items were packed into a large moving unit. Naturally, I ventured out to speak to them and get the basic details on where they were heading. Turns out they were staying in town, but had been offered a cash payment for their home that would enable them to move to the nicest part of town. I was kind of surprised, and when I pressed them to know why such an amount was offered for their home, I was met with a simple answer. The new owner just loves the view. It took them only 2 days to empty the home. I was going to miss the sound of their kids playing, but I could not blame them for taking up such an offer. Walking down to the local corner store, I noticed a puddle in the road. Now, normally that should not be such a shock, but we had had no rain in months by this point, and the rest of the street was as dry as the desert floor. I was stuck, staring for a moment at the puddle. Suddenly, the puddle was disturbed by what I at first thought was a walking stick, but looking up, saw it was the pointed end of his umbrella. He walked right by me with a simple "afternoon." He didn't look back and walked in the direction of the home I shared with Ashley. Admittedly, being taken aback, it took a moment for me to register who I saw. Then I attempted to catch up to him, but he was gone. I looked back and nearly threw up, seeing the puddle was not there. Perhaps I was losing my mind. You might be reading the notes of a madman. In case I am still sane, however, I shall finish writing while I can. In the middle of the week, early in the morning, I heard the sounds of a moving unit approaching the home. Ashley was also awoken by the noise, and in her true form, took this as an opportunity for some early morning lovemaking. After we each got some more sleep and a shower, I headed down to the kitchen to fix some coffee and toast. After setting up Ashley's mug for when she would eventually slink down the stairs to start her day, I stepped out to the deck and sipped as I watched the movers, giving a kind of wave and a coffee cup salute. The men simply smiled and continued their early morning labor. Ashley joined me a few moments later with her own cup. She leaned against the deck rail and sipped her brew. I took a nice, hot swig as the new owner came around the corner. The hot, black water spewed out of my mouth in shock. I involuntarily drowned out the sounds of protest and disgust from Ashley. It was him. The man with the umbrella. That smile of his. He seemed to smirk as he entered the home, having watched me spray my love with hot boiled bean juice. Not only was he jovial in my terrible moment, but he was also still carrying that umbrella. The sun was out and it had not rained. If not for shade, Why did he need it? For reasons not known to me, this was making me feel what can nearly be described as a hatred for him. On a Thursday afternoon, I was in my parlor, waiting for Ashley to come home from her errands when I heard a bit of laughter outside. Soon after, Ashley came through the door with a plate of sweets and a smile. It was the smile of a woman who had been given generous compliments. It was an almost embarrassed smile. While I've never really been a jealous man, I was feeling it now. Questioning her on this, she told me our new neighbor had gifted the sweets to her. I was skeptical, and she expressed to me that perhaps I should stop judging the man on looks and maybe do the grown-up thing and get to know him. I didn't want to do the grown-up thing. She mocked me for this, of course, but something about that terrible man made me uneasy. Was it just the bother of the umbrella? No. I had recognized him. I knew it was his visage that I had spotted those months ago in Samantha's eyes as she passed on. I was not crazy. It took only a few days of realizing that Ashley was not going to let this go that I agreed to meet our new neighbor. For lack of a better way to describe it, she had cut me off until I learned to play nice. It was a nice early evening with a warm breeze. I stepped out, smelled the air, then moved down our steps along the sidewalk and over the cobbles to his entryway. I was just about to use his knocker when the door opened swiftly. I almost tripped inside from the surprise of his presence. His smile was as I recalled it from the cafe. His eyes, dark, and I could swear they were looking straight through me. Oh, hello. I'm sorry to arrive unexpectedly. I felt like such a fool. Not at all, Mr. Stevens. Please, come in. Your wife informed me that you would be stopping by. She is lovely in a tasteful way, I must admit, he said, however dryly. Call me Gavin, I said, attempting a smile. No, came his terse yet awkwardly pleasant reply. I'm afraid, Mr. Stevens, that formality must be maintained at all times in my worldview. It keeps things pragmatic and simple. Please, follow me. Mind the fixtures. I had no reply to this at all other than to follow him. As we walked, I saw artwork that must have come from all over the world and from cultures long since past. Battle masks, cups, goblets, paintings, swords, even rare bits of clothing adorned his home. And what shall I call you? Ehrlich Dispater is my name, came his response. You may call me Mr. Dispater. Tell me, Mr. Dispater, have we met before? I must admit, you seem rather familiar to me. I knew that he knew me, but I wanted to hear him say it. Something about this man still made me cringe. His response was as cold as his greeting. I do not answer unnecessary questions, Mr. Stevens, he said as we entered his back parlor. It was spacious, or at least gave the idea of largeness based on the decorating. There was little furniture, save for a small desk, a typewriter, and one chair on both sides of the desk. He approached the typewriter and gestured for me to sit across from him. I did so and looked around. Above the fireplace was a painting of Noah and the Ark. On the wall to my right were several draperies that looked like they came from the Ming Dynasty, and to my left, an abstract painting that made me feel a little sick. At the top was a goat-like man with a snake for a tail, holding a large hook. The creature was leaning down, and in his other hand was a hook that was sticking through a woman tending a garden. The painter had even painted blood coming from the woman's mouth, yet she looked happy. It was the kind of visage that one can immediately hate. He noticed my face as I looked at it. It is an antique painting, Mr. Stevens. The artist called it the happiness of a blissful demise. It was a gift, you might say. His face still smiling as he looked at the picture, seeming also like it was his favorite piece in the house. Tell me, Mr. Stevens, are you happy? Do you feel your life has met its potential? His questions were so abrupt and personal. I admit that I was taken aback. I was also doing what I could to appear confident, so I chose to answer his question with a bit of my own abruptness. Yes, Mr. Dispater, I am happy. My life meets its potential daily. No complaints on my end. He leaned back in his chair and placed his umbrella against the desk, proceeding to type on the typewriter. I see. What other lies would you like to tell me about today, Mr. Stevens? Do you think that you are so cunning that I can't see exactly how bored you are in this life? Do you know why I chose to move into this abode? I shall tell you. It is for the view. The view, Mr. Stevens, of what you are doing with your life, and thusly, from there, what the rest of this quiet little town is doing with theirs as well. Sitting there, knowing full well I was now in a bad situation, I couldn't help but wonder just who exactly this man really was, and why anyone in their right mind would choose to speak in such a manner. It came to me that perhaps this fellow was not in his right mind. He was certainly, to me it seemed, to be 2 eggs short of a full breakfast. I began to rise up to see myself out. I didn't care if that was informal or not. I couldn't care less at this point of his tender sensibilities. Turning to go, the bastard was suddenly in front of me. Our discussion is not over, Mr. Stevens. The Spader raised the umbrella as if to strike me. When the sound of my alarm woke me, I sat up like a bolt. Ashley rolled over. Her breasts peeked from beneath her bed shirt.
"What's wrong?" she asked lazily.
I was sweating and cold. Was that really a dream? Couldn't have been. Could it? I rose up and got ready for work. As much as I wanted to, it was Ashley who would be denied the morning routine today, and not me. Chapter 4: The Rose Garden.
At the fire station, I was busy getting medical supplies checked in. Not that we had needed them in some time, but quality counts, right? My captain approached me with a small card inside a deep red envelope. He shrugged, giving it to me, but as my name was on it, it was his duty to deliver. I felt a sickness in the pit of my stomach. As I opened it, inside was a card shaped like a raindrop. Upon opening, thin red letters read, "Mr. Stevens, I enjoyed our chat last night. Please do me the courtesy to meet me tonight at the Remington Rose Gardens. Let's say 8 on the dot, shall we? Remember, it would be uncouth to be late for such an occasion. Yours neighborly, Mr. Ehrlich Despater."
I quickly shoved the invitation into my pocket and looked around to see if he was somehow watching me. I looked at my watch and realized I was late to meet Ashley and her folks for lunch. We all know what a great idea it is to be late meeting your future in-laws. After rushing downtown, I caught up to them in their favorite lunch spot. The Calico Cabana served a wide array of fresh lunch options. It was vegetarian even before everyone's appetites changed. I had leaped over a puddle in front of the patio area. As I opened the gate, I turned my head in a moment, watching as the puddle evaporated right in front of my eyes. Shaking my head, I had to remember to make a doctor's appointment, and soon. Ashley gave me a death glare as I approached and mouthed, "I'm so sorry." Her mother and father looked up as she introduced me. Her father shook my hand, and as we sat, her mother let out a disapproving, "So can we order now? I'm hungry." I could tell you that the rest of the lunch turned around and went really well, but that would be dishonest. It went poorly, to say the least. I couldn't help it. Despater was in my head. I lifted my water glass, and I could swear I saw him in the reflection. I saw him in my soup spoon. I saw him and that stupid umbrella as a shadow on the floor. I could feel him. I was scared my water in my glass would evaporate and be gone. And worse, that no one else would see this.
"Are you feeling okay, Gavin? My God, you're so pale and clammy."
She was exacerbated as she touched my forehead with her hand. No, I'm fine. I was trying to brush it off, but her father decided this was the time to chime in. "Good God, man. We come here for a nice lunch. If you were under the weather, you could have been polite enough to let us know. What if we get it now? That is an extremely rude thing to do, young man." His wife was quick to chime in on the opportunity to show her own displeasure. "Now, Harold, I doubt the boy means it. Some people can't help having a lower upbringing." She then immediately looked at Ashley. "Honey, you know you can always come back home. I know you find this place charming, but the people..." Eventually, the food arrived, and it was an utterly silent lunch. Afterward, Ashley hugged her folks goodbye and giggled a bit, walking me back to work and apologizing for her parents. I had known they were what some in our area would call higher stock, but I had no idea just what that meant until now. I'm glad to be of lower stock, I can tell you that. The rest of the afternoon was thankfully uneventful. After arriving home, I found a note from Ashley telling me she was going out with some ladies for drinks and mischief. This was good. It meant I did not have to come up with a cover story for going out to the Rose Garden tonight. I would go and meet Mr. Despater, and we would have this out. Knowing that mischief for Ashley meant going to the lake to skinny dip, told me that I would have until plenty past dark to be home. First, there was a scalding hot shower. Then I decided to shave and look my best for the ass-kicking I was planning to dish out. As I picked up my straight razor, I closed the medicine cabinet,
Shock and horror filled me as I saw him in the mirror and not my own face. I shrieked, slipped, and as I fell, sliced my throat wide open, the blade cutting deep as it ran from one side to the other. Blood rushed out of my throat like a flood of hot soup. I grasped at my throat, holding my neck, knowing I would be found dead on the bathroom floor of an apparent suicide. Ashley would hate herself for not seeing the signs of depression that I did not in reality have. I grabbed the closest towel and held it to me in what I was sure was a futile attempt to stop the blood loss. After several moments, I realized I wasn't dead. I didn't even feel lightheaded from bleeding all over the bathroom. The towel had soaked up more than its share of blood. I saw one of my old containers of medical adhesive, and after a long battle with spewing warm, dark red blood, I managed to seal the wound. I even gave 2 extra coats of the glue, then began to examine the cut. It was not my imagination. I should be dead. I should be unequivocally dead. I should be, but I wasn't. By this time it was 7:30. I was barely going to make it. I washed up as much as possible, dressed, creatively covered my neck with a scarf, and headed to the rose garden. At the entrance to the garden, I saw more than one couple leaving through the old iron gate. The security guard was about to lock up the garden for the evening. I did what anyone in this situation would do. After bribing the guard, I made my way to the middle, assuming this would be the most sensible place to meet. I saw the bastard, standing in the middle of the garden, a bowler atop his head, his umbrella again in use as a walking stick or cane. His back was to me, and his long black overcoat went down his back to just past his knees. He plucked one of the roses and gave it a sniff. As he turned to me with that dreadful smile, I did the cowardly thing, and with no warning, cold-cocked him across his face. His whole fucking face. I put every ounce of my energy into my momentum. The bones in my hand fractured beneath the skin, and I let out a yelp that set off dogs barking. The pain made me nearly pass out. He didn't move an inch. Not one fucking inch. My knees buckled, and I fell to the ground. Mr. Despater used the crooked end of the umbrella under my chin to lift me up. Not just to lift my head, but to move me up to my feet again.
Mr. Stevens, that was quite disconcerting. You are a truly callous person. Before I could do more than moan in pain, he grabbed my arm, and with a surprising amount of force straightened my hand. I don't know if it was shock or some trick, but the pain was gone. It was gone in an instant, and I backed away quickly. Who the fuck are you? I was trying not to shout, but there was so much adrenaline that I could barely contain my voice. What is going on? Why are you taunting me, you son of a bitch? He smiled and resumed his long smell of the rose. Mr. Stevens, several months ago you asked a favor of me, and I granted you that favor. When you came to my home, after being granted your wish, you could not simply be honest with me. What poor sports you people are. Given the world and you want the stars. I shook my head and looked at my hand. I never met you before. I don't know you. What favor? His response chilled every single solitary fiber of my being. 1 year. You asked for 1 year of peace. No death. To never see anything like that again. It was the night the woman called Samantha was bisected as her horse and buggy were, rather violently, struck by a large automobile. Do you not recall my answer to your request? I was quite clear when I answered you in the affirmative. He took a few steps toward me. Do you recall what you offered in exchange? What you offered after your friend told you of the child's death in the same accident? What you offered as you were bathed in rain and the blood of the red-headed woman? I looked to Despater, trying to recall the conversation with Carl from months ago. I said I would give my life. The words left me shaking. Mr. Despater grinned and turned away from me. That is exactly what I remember you offering as well. And a bit more. Chapter 5. 1 month to go. 1 month from now, it will be April 12th, I thought to myself as I began to pack items at work. When I met Mr. Despater, it had been nearly 6 months since that dreaded night. In the rose garden, he showed me visions that I could never truly express in words. I remember I had begun to approach him when he filled my mind with such visions. Centuries and eons of war and pestilence filled my mind's eyes. Biblical events that many people thought were just stories, myths, and legends. The Battle of Thermopylae, gladiator games in Rome, slave ships ripe with the smell of death in the hulls. It wasn't just the battles. I saw famine and disease, the creation of cancer, machinery malfunctions, any manner of anything causing the demise of living things. Lastly, he showed me visions of nightmare creatures so wicked that one would believe each to be the beast himself. These beings, for lack of any better term, seemed to serve as a catalyst in many of the events I was to visually endure. As I came to, shuddering, Mr. Despater chuckled. Yes, those are my children, Mr. Stevens. You might refer to them in your culture as imps. They are wicked little things, but they do help me get my work done. Have you ever had a near miss, Mr. Stevens? A moment, perhaps, where it was just too close for comfort. If so, you were dealing with an imp in training, so to speak. An imp who nearly had you, but not quite. They can only succeed in their games if I allow it, after all. It is amazing, though. There are many things that can only, nearly, kill you. It was then that I had run from him. He was ahead of me at every turn with a quip to let me in just a bit more on his game. Finally, I made it to the gate, the locked gate. So much for the security guard. It was there that Mr. Despater was on the other side. Mr. Stevens, you're embarrassing yourself. I grabbed a stick. I know full well I must have looked like a fool. Are you the devil? Lucifer himself? I was horrified that he might say yes. Not at all, Mr. Stevens, he said as he ghosted through the gate, becoming like smoke yet solid at the same time. The devil is something your pontiff wants you to fear. You don't need to fear a god. God? I asked. I said a god, Mr. Stevens. Please pay attention to the details. My realm is death. It is no moral judgment, no condemnation. Simple life and death. What you have done with what you were given, good or bad, means little to me, save for one aspect. Mr. Stevens, I'll ask again, do you feel you have lived up to your potential? I swatted him with my stick. It didn't work. I don't know, okay? I didn't know I was making a deal. I can promise you that much. I've never been a believer in much other than doing my best. Saving lives. Yes, I'm bored. Yes, I know I can do more. But I'm also content, you arrogant son of a bitch. I'm content with the life I have lived. What do you want from me? I had awoken again in a deep sweat. Ashley rolled over and looked at me. Her smile filled my mind, but in the back, so much fear. I could tell she sensed it. Her kisses were soft and smooth. You okay, baby? She asked, knowing I wasn't. Before I could answer, she pulled off her top and moved my hands to her breasts and laid me back. As she moved over me, it took more concentration than any man should require to focus on our morning lovemaking. I felt guilty of not being a great lover that morning, but those dreams felt so real. I knew I was getting distant, withdrawn, worried. It was my fault for pushing her away. She had moved out by the end of the week, saying she was too young to spend her life devoted to a man who couldn't see her. I can't blame her, really. Everywhere I go, I see that horrible man and his stupid umbrella. I ran into her a couple of times in town, once with Carl from work. They seemed happy. At that time, it wasn't until just now that I realized April 12th was so close. On my way to work today, I strolled past the rose garden. The flowers had started to wilt. Chapter 6. April 12th comes again. I woke up this morning. The calendar said April 12th. I took my shower, then looked at the scar on my neck. The scar was evidence to me that I was not going crazy. It was the first sign for Ashley to leave me. I can't say I blame her for that. On my way down to work, I ambled past the rose garden again, and for the first time in a year, I saw death. A honeybee lay under a now brown flower. It was as dead as a doorbell. The station was empty when I arrived. A note from my boss expressing that they had a call early on about midnight. I could hear the morning crew returning and coming through the large, wide doors. Carl has blood on him, but seemed jovial. No one had died, but it had been a close call. Trainee, I thought to myself. Thunder could be heard in the distance. Clouds were rolling in from the east and darkening the sky much the way they had 1 year ago. The shuddering feeling in my stomach grew. The chief approached me and handed me an eerily familiar piece of mail. It was a small card. I am sure you can guess who sent it. The request was to meet him at 8 p.m. in the Remington Rose Garden, just as we had before. I can be totally honest in telling you fear was not what compelled me. Rather, it was exhaustion. I was so tired of this man, seeing him everywhere. As I walked home, I noticed the house next door was empty. I ate dinner, cleaned up my house, and decided to skip my evening shave just to be safe. I would meet Mr. Despater, and when I did, I would meet him on my level. "It is good to see you, Mr. Stevens," he said, grinning ear to ear. As I approached him, I again took note of his horrible umbrella. "Ehrlich, I am sad to say you look well." His grin faltered, but only for a moment. "Mr. Stevens, you try too hard to be the type of man you are not. Life, as you know, is desperately short. No sense wasting it on petty nuance." He winked, and as he turned and looked away from me, he opened his umbrella. He opened the fucking thing and moved it upwards for protection from the impending weather. "I can smell the rain, Mr. Stevens. I hope you had a nice year. A year of no rain is the perfect recipe for a flash flood." It wasn't until that moment that I realized his true intentions. Our town was in a major floodplain. It wasn't just my life that was going to end tonight. Mr. Death was here, and he was going to take us all.